Hello everybody, welcome back to Anglo Election Insights. We are counting down the days till the federal election, coming up in 6 days as I record this video, probably 5 days as you watch it. All I'm looking to do today is just run through a few regional battlegrounds of my choosing, mostly just down the east coast. And you can see there's a whole bunch of parties and independents and that sort of thing vying for these seats, so should be interesting. I've crunched the numbers in terms of changes to the age groups on the electoral roll as well, which should hopefully give us a bit of further insight, and I'll just run over some polling details as well. So firstly, I want to jump over to YouGov, who have just been trashing the coalition, beating down on them way worse than some of the other pollsters. You can see here, that 52.5, yeah, okay, whatever. Then it was 53 with the coalition, basically down a couple of percent on primary votes since 2022, and then they just threw them down to 31 and extended that two-party preferred lead. Now, at the same time, interestingly, Newspoll, who've just come out like an hour or so ago with an unchanged, basically, result from last week. So we can see that, over the same period where Newspoll, who are also affiliated with Labor's internal pollster, I'll have you know, they're recording no real change, but YouGov are saying that the coalition's vote basically continues to deteriorate. Now, just jumping over to Canada real quick, they do have an MRP released for the 2025 election coming up tomorrow, basically, and they're calling for a pretty solid Liberal majority, Liberals, of course, being the centre-left party in Canada, winning 185 seats, which is a majority of about 13. So we'll be able to get a bit of an early read on YouGov's methodology if the Canadian election kind of pans out that way, or if something different happens. So just thought I'd point that out, just something to keep an eye on, that if that prediction pans out well, then maybe we need to start really taking what YouGov is saying quite seriously. Elsewhere, and much more relevant to this video, they have done polling on 10 regional seats. The overall sample is 3,000, which means that the sample per seat is kind of around the 300 mark, which is not very much, but they've weighted it to a larger survey, as far as I'm aware. So, these numbers should be, I guess, somewhat reliable, I suppose, but I'll go through them in a little bit more detail, but it looks to me as if it just looks really hard to get a correct sample in some of these seats. Seats like Dixon and Patterson, for example, the numbers actually look sort of correct as far as what I would have expected, and they're more kind of built up metropolitan style seats. So potentially like a sampling problem there. Even Ballarat, that looks probably about right, although the ALP primary looks pretty low there. Perhaps it's because of the Greens. I don't know if rural polling is something that the industry has quite kind of managed to come to grips with yet. It would be exceedingly difficult to weight appropriately and actually find a representative sample. So I'm definitely taking these with a grain of salt, but we'll run through them anyway, and just other bits of news along the way. So why don't we start right at the top end and talk about Leichhardt, where Dutton was campaigning, I think on Saturday. So we don't have a YouGov poll there, but I have been crunching the numbers, and what I can report is that there has been a bit of a surge in its population. Its enrollment is up 4.5% compared to 2022, and about 40% of that has come from the 70 plus age bracket, which, according to Redbridge and a couple of other pollsters, is an age bracket that's not really swinging away from the coalition the way younger groups are. But having said that, in this 18 to 24 range, there has also been a reasonably significant amount of new enrolments, but Leichhardt is held on a 3.5% margin, so Labor were probably hoping for slightly more advantageous demographic change there. Notice here that the 50 plus cohort makes up they are 3.18%, like a greater share of the enrolment as compared to 2022, and they make up the vast majority of the increase in enrolment. So that was quite interesting to me, but don't discount that there's these much younger voters who've moved in greater numbers as well. So that's why I continue to give that one away to the coalition. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Just for fun, I have made Dixon LMP just because I know there are people in the comments who are really hopeful of a Labor or independent win there, and I just want to affirm that I really don't believe it's happening. Part of what informs that is not only that even in this poll, YouGov was unable to find much of the LNP primary falling away, but also in the past where like tealish independents have run alongside Labor and run like fourth or third, the preference distribution hasn't been as tight to Labor as it would have been the other way round, which doesn't really help. And also, I would have expected that if there was genuinely something happening in Dixon, you would probably see Labor campaigning more heavily in places like Petrie or Longman as well, but I haven't really heard anything about those seats, so I'm going to assume that that's all a bit of a nothing burger. Although, I have heard that a bit further down in Bonner that the Labor Party are looking at increasing their ad spend. So just want to keep in mind. So let's get moving. The seat of Richmond, which I was supposed to talk about in my Greens videos, but I left it out inexplicably. So we'll talk about it as part of my regional battlegrounds today. And when I was crunching the numbers, what I found was that there's been a big increase to the enrolment, 6.5%. So big growth in that federal electorate. And yes, a bit of it's come from the older age bracket, but a lot of it has come from like older millennials and Gen Z as well. Like look at the spike in 18 and 19-year-olds. Look at the numbers for Gen Z and into the younger millennial cohort, and even 40 to 44-year-olds. Huge numbers. And at the three candidate preferred level, there's really not much of a difference between the Greens and Labor. I've talked about this seat before as being one where if there's any sort of drag on the Green vote in the inner city, that probably doesn't apply here. It's not really the same issues. Climate's still a really big issue. The Nats vote is likely to recover, and they'll comfortably stay ahead of both Labor and the Greens. But I think Labor are in a serious battle to stay in the race here. Otherwise, this is going to be looking at a Greens-Nats contest, and I think the Greens are absolutely in pole position to win that race. So it's going to go down to the wire again, but the Greens are campaigning really heavily. They seem to have received, a demographic boost, whereas, as we noted in central Brisbane, they seem to be fighting against the tide a little bit. So as such, I'm actually prepared to give this one away to the Greens, so I have Richmond going green. Kalpa, I've talked about before. I've flip-flopped a bit on it, to be honest, but it's really hard to keep this one in the Nats column with the way the national polling is looking. Sounds like Kaz Hayes is running a really strong campaign. When I looked at the numbers, this was an interesting seat where the total enrolment grew by 1.4%, but they actually lost territory overall. So it indicates that Port Macquarie and Coffs and the areas surrounding are growing considerably. I did notice that the 70 plus age group experienced the most growth in this seat, but it was relatively well balanced between the three age groupings that I've got here. And honestly, this 34 to 51, had I had my time again, I probably would have made it 34 to 55 or maybe 34 to 60, just so that it was a more like even sample. But oh well, you live, you learn. Notice that, yeah, these sort of retirees moving in, that's always going to be a feature of a place like Port Macquarie, but pretty reasonable numbers of those kind of younger Gen Z voters coming in as well. So interesting. I also think that in a seat like Kalpa, where you've got a very likable Teal candidate who has run before, I don't necessarily think that the coalition necessarily owns those older voters in the way that maybe they would in a coalition versus Labor contest. So for the moment, I'm giving that one away to the independent, but I do expect it to go down to the wire. There was some reporting also that the Nats are getting pretty pessimistic about this seat, but I've talked about the Nats and expectation management. They love it. We'll keep moving. Let's have a look at Kair, where I think we do have some YouGov numbers. Yep, so they have the Nats vote collapsing from 47% down to 25%. Obviously, that's partly a factor of the incumbent popular member Andrew G defecting. That's obviously going to drag a lot on the Nats vote. You have Labor crashing down to 8.2. This used to be a marginal like Nat Labor seat. It's quite amazing to see the Labor vote that low. Greens at 5. One Nation pushing 15 there. That's quite interesting. They did relatively well in 2022 as well, and their preferences could actually be quite decisive, depending on who makes the final count. And then they've got independents polling near 40%. Of course, that's going to be split between two independents who occupy different kind of parts of the political landscape, and depending on who gets knocked out, that's obviously going to be quite crucial to this seat. I can't imagine that the Nats primary is going to be that low. Kair's quite a big seat. It does have some regional cities. It's got Bathurst, it's got Lithgow, it's got Orange, and I do wonder how well the pollsters have managed to capture the mood of, say, the northern end of this electorate, which is very rural. Whether or not this poll really reflects the reality of what voting intention is going to be in all corners of this electorate, but it does make for interesting reading. Personally, when I had a look at the changes in enrolment, you could see a general theme here in these regional electorates was a big boost in the very youngest cohort, but then not so much as you get into kind of Gen Z and then the younger millennials. And then the highest growth was from not only the 50 plus cohort, but particularly the 70 plus cohort. But again, like I said for Kalpa, that doesn't necessarily mean that the coalition owns those votes. We shall keep moving. So I've got that as technically a Nat gain. So let's zoom in a little bit towards the Hunter and Central Coast. So the seat of Hunter, we also have numbers from YouGov here. They have Labor sitting on just under 36, which that feels a bit low given how popular the local member is. I would have thought his primary at least would stay still with, a bit of a sophomore surge and that sort of, all those sorts of factors kind of working for him. And, he's really made a name for himself, really cut a path for himself and become quite well known and well liked and respected within the electorate from what I can tell. The Nats vote crashing all the way down below 15 seems a little bit fanciful for mine. I do think that their floor is a little bit higher than that. But then the One Nation vote is the real shocker here at 25%. Now, they did poll somewhere around, I think, 21, 22, maybe 23% back in 2019, and that was with the same candidate, Stuart Bonds. We also have the others at 15%, which, if you're interested, that's a very, very small portion of that is Trumpets of Patriots. And the Green vote at 8.8. So I think I haven't seen a two candidate preferred for this one, but it would be a Labour versus One Nation race. I think what this might be demonstrating is that the coalition strategy of pushing nuclear in a region where the coal industry still casts a fairly long shadow over the economic outlook of the region, and the employment prospects of a lot of trades workers there. It just seems to me that the nuclear debate isn't particularly helping, but at the same time, Labor's push for renewables is also not going down massively well. So it just leaves this big gap for someone to come up the middle and talk about sort of new investment in coal, and that's pretty much what One Nation is doing, with a candidate who I think has worked in the mines and that sort of thing, and he has that kind of unique appeal that the Labour MP Dan Repicoli also has. So it wouldn't be altogether surprising if the contest did come down to the two of them, although I think Labour would be in more trouble if the Nationals were able to stay ahead of One Nation. So I've given that one to Labour for now. There is also, by the way, this supposed seat polling from KJC Research, which had the Liberals ahead in Tangney and Blair, which is pretty wild. They also had the Greens ahead of an unnamed opponent in Richmond. But here in Hunter, Labour was only up by 4% with a 14% component that were unsure. So an interesting one. But it seems, well, just looking at these two seats, Blair and Tangney, it seems that the coalition have done relatively well out of these polls, but Labor's still in the lead in Hunter. I'd be interested to see what other seats that they polled and what the full kind of numbers were. But I've given Hunter to Labour for the moment. Patterson, very interesting. Let's have a look here. We've got the Liberals down on 26, basically. Labour all the way down on 31. And, this is a seat where a decade ago they could expect to poll in the mid-40s. We've got the Greens on 11.5. One Nation also doing very well here. This is another seat where energy policy is going to be key. And the Independent, who is sort of Liberal Party diaspora, involved in local government in Maitland, I think, polling at 16%. And I've lost access to the pre-poll numbers from that first day of pre-poll, but it had a similar kind of spread where the Independent and One Nation were doing quite well and the major party vote was muted. So there could be something to that. This could end up being a very messy count where, similar to the Werribee by-election, where both major parties pretty much fail to clear 30, and you get this very, very messy preference distribution. But in this case, if a centre-right Independent and One Nation are soaking up a lot of the other vote, then that probably puts the coalition in pole position if they're able to stay close enough on primaries. So for the moment, I've given that one to the coalition, just because I think at this stage Labour are going to struggle to get far enough ahead, and those offshore wind farms are going to prove to be, a difficult selling point for them, and they just don't have the talented and well-liked MP like they do in Hunter to help defend this seat. Dobell was interesting because you guys might recall on the Redbridge Accent MRP, they actually credited it as a coalition gain, with Shortland also being too close to call. That I think is just going to be, and I might have mentioned this before, but that's basically going to be like the MacArthur from the last MRP. It's just not realistic, I don't think. We don't have any polling from Dobell, but when I had a look at the numbers, there was nothing in there that really suggested that there's any kind of demographic change that is massively favouring the coalition there. It's pretty evenly spread, and in fact, if anything, it's starting to skew a bit younger. And just on that point, similar sort of thing is happening in Paterson, where they've lost a bit of territory in the redistribution, and the majority of it was actually 50 plus age bracket. But having said that, they lost most of that territory to the Hunter electorate, and so basically like gave away like younger voters, but the notional two-party preferred margin actually dropped for Labor, whereas it increased in Hunter. So quite interesting there. Next door in Robertson, I'm also continuing to give that one away to Labor. It's going to be very close there though. Again, if we have a look at the demographic change, there's nothing too significant, although these older Gen Z, younger millennials, their proportion of the electorate is decreasing, whereas the older cohort, 50 plus, making up a much greater share of the 2% growth to enrollment. So, if the coalition are having a relatively good night, then that could definitely be a really interesting one to watch. Moving along, next one I've got here is the seat of Whitlam, where there are these reports where the coalition's like their insiders and their internal polls are saying that, similar to Gordon, that there's like a kind of surprising swing to them. They've had that big mess with their candidate disendorsing the ex-UAP guy and having to rush in the guy who used to hold the state seat of Wallandilly, if that's how you say it. However, Labor also have their own issues with the candidate. She was, she's of the left faction, lives much further up the Illawarra, was, I think, twice a Greens candidate in like unwinnable Senate positions. Having a look at what's happened there demographics-wise, another big jump in the very youngest cohort, but then not so much with the rest of Gen Z. And then a big boost in terms of the older cohort, who make up, more than half of the increase in enrollment there. And then finally, Gilmore. This is a super interesting one. So looking at the YouGov numbers, they actually have the Liberals trailing on primary vote. Big Green vote. The Greens are really improving their stock along the south coast. One Nation at 6%. And interestingly enough, the Independent, the Teal Independent, who I think is really looking to peel support off Andrew Constance, who is seen as someone who was like a more moderate Liberal, who was going to champion sort of the climate change cause and the push for renewables within the party in a sort of Matt Keane style manner, especially given the bushfires and the sort of the debate that came out of those fires. But he's since pivoted pretty firmly to nuclear, and I think some of his supporters have considered that a bit of a betrayal. And I think the Teal Independent is looking to pick up some of that support. It like I mentioned with Dixon, when you have both a Teal, when you have a Teal that's likely to run behind Labor in these marginal seats, I don't think it really helps Labor all that much. But if indeed the Liberals are trailing on primaries, they're not really competitive in that seat at all. I still have it as a Liberal gain, just still on the back of party insiders on both sides saying that they think it will change hands, and with this news poll coming out with an unchanged 34 for Labor, 35 for Coalition, I just think it's a very slight change that is needed in Gilmore, and we're starting to get numbers that suggest that maybe that sort of slight change is all we're going to get. At the same time, I do think it's hard to tell what the overall trend is in Gilmore because of the like sort of more like the 2019 specific incident with the Liberal Party, and then Constance got a swing to him in 2022, but where was sort of the real baseline level of support had the 2019 candidate pre-selection mess not occurred? It's hard to tell, but it does seem that maybe going by the 2023 state election, that there is a bit of movement away from the Liberals, sort of from Nowra all the way down the south coast. So if we could be seeing that playing out, and this polling would suggest that is what's happening. Then a couple of seats in Victoria just to finish off. So starting with Monash, this wasn't part of this polling series. For me, I still have it as a Liberal win. I just think it's going to be a little bit too messy down ticket. I think with two sort of very distinct independents running, with Labor still somewhat competitive in this seat, I just think that the Liberals will be able to open up too big a lead on primaries, and I don't think there's going to be the preference discipline for anyone to catch them. A little bit like what I'm predicting up in Kair. And then lastly in Wannon. So this poll was particularly bad for Dan Tehan, which had him trailing on primaries by 2.5%, and I think the two candidate preferred figure was something like a 7% lead for Alex Dyson. I can't imagine that Dan Tehan's primary falls that much. Yeah, it probably falls, but I don't think it falls that much. And if we have a look at some of the number crunching that I did in Victoria, I'll just quickly do Monash as well. Like 60% of the increase in Monash's enrolment came from the 70 plus cohort, and in Wannon it was about half, just from 70 plus. And again, there's that caveat that in a contest between the coalition and an independent, maybe the retirees and the boomers aren't as rusted onto the coalition as they might be elsewhere. But again, like I've mentioned with Alex Dyson, his personal appeal to that generation might be slightly compromised by his sort of slight kind of eccentricness, shall we say, which I've talked about before. But I'm perfectly willing to entertain the idea that support for the coalition just isn't going to hold up this time, and that Alex Dyson's not he's not as off-putting as I might be making him sound like he is. He comes across in this campaign as quite inoffensive, and I think the Liberal attack ads on him, if anything, have backfired. So yeah, I mean, I think it's coming down to the wire, and this poll from YouGov certainly suggesting that Dyson has the advantage, and if that's really where it's at, that wouldn't really surprise me at all, but I don't think it's quite 7%. That seems a bit much for me. I think that's about it for today, so hopefully this extra data helps you guys kind of understand what's happening at the age group demographic level and how that could impact some of these races. Let me know your thoughts on some of these seats. I saw that Aussies Elect did a full 150 seat prediction. I don't really feel like making one. I'll probably put one out on Friday, but there's just so much movement happening. There's supposedly so many different currents and swings going all sorts of different ways that I'm sort of a bit gun shy at the moment, and I just want to wait until we have another round of sort of final polls from other firms like Essential and Resolve, another Morgan, and maybe some more polling from like Demos AU and some of those guys just before I really try to go for all 150 seats. But I'll probably be talking a little bit more about the coalition's position this week. I think some people with the YouGov polling and the leadership ratings and that sort of thing have just run away with this idea that Labor's definitely in for a majority, and it's it's going to be a kind of a historic win or that sort of thing. I'm definitely not booking that one in. I'm definitely not fully sold on that idea, but at the same time, it's the way the coalition's talking about, there's heaps of undecideds, there's lots of vote to be won out there. Like, I half believe it, but whether or not they actually have the ability to win those votes and whether or not that's actually true are both things that I'm sort of questioning at the moment. And it does just have that slight reek of desperation, doesn't it? Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you're enjoying the channel and the content. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and you're enjoying the content. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.